My name is Adam Feinberg, and welcome to Harlem Stories.
And I'm here as well. Mark Becker is my name. I'm an agent with Elegant, as is Adam.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. We love having you as a co-host, Mark. It's been great feedback so far, and we're gonna just dive right into it today. But before I do, just a reminder, we are now on a bi-weekly schedule for all future episodes. But today we're gonna talk about getting to know Hamilton Heights.
All right.
So first thing is almost kind of obvious. The first couple points about the neighborhood. Well, obviously, Heights is in the name, so it's in an elevated position. Much of the neighborhood is actually over 100 feet above sea level. So not too worried about climate change. However, there's always a but there. The subways can still get overrun. And unfortunately, I've seen many videos, 2 blocks from me from the subway station over the one train where, we have these flash flood warnings and the heavy rain. And all of a sudden, the stairs to the one train at the 145th Street, it becomes kind of like a mini waterfall. So,
yeah. Well, you know what? It's not rivaling Mount Everest, but for Manhattan, which is a fairly flat island, it's pretty far up there.
Yeah, exactly. So, especially with the concerns about sea level rise, we're less concerned about it, but obviously we're impacted all about this. But, that could be in our marketing materials, right? Climate change resistant. Right?
It's your one bastion of hope.
Yeah, exactly. And the other part, the name Alexander Hamilton was one of our founding fathers, and the neighborhood was named after him, well, primarily because he actually owned land in much of the neighborhood. So his home still is, contained on the edge of our neighborhood, actually been relocated now for the second time and been moved around the corner back in 2008 into St. Nicholas Park.
Wow.
So, there's some awesome videos out there. You might have heard me or Mark mention that in previous episodes or not. But, certainly that's a cool video if you're interested in seeing how they wound up moving a 200-plus-year-old house, many feet in the air and down a steep hill. So kind of interesting.
Quite an undertaking. Must have been a nervous day for the bulldoze driver.
I'd imagine so, but at the same time, I think the speed that they were moving at, I think equated to something like 4 miles an hour. So
no speeding ticket there.
Yeah, exactly. So, while they're certainly moving and nervous with every little creak and movement and bump, at the same time, they weren't exactly moving quickly there.
Right.
So anyway, we're going to cover the many aspects of the neighborhood in terms of, things like, some of the parks, higher education. We'll talk a little bit about the housing and culture, and some other notable points is, what we're going to cover today. So I guess the first thing that, people want to know about in terms of the neighborhood is where is it located, right? The north-south points are pretty easy, from 135th Street to 155th Street. The west point or west side of the neighborhood is pretty easy. It goes up to the Hudson River. It's the eastern borders that are a little less definable. So, some people will say that it's Edgecombe Avenue all the way down to 135th. And Edgecombe is certainly the eastern border from 155th down to 145th, but then it kind of makes more of a jagged edge.
It's kind of one of those deals where if you're buying, it's Harlem. If you're selling, it's Hamilton Heights.
Right, exactly. In fact, I see that quite a bit. So, that's one of those things that we encounter on kind of a regular routine basis. So what makes Hamilton Heights so special? Well, there's actually 2 different historic districts within the neighborhood, and now there's a proposal on the desk of our governor, Kathy Hochul, to actually make most of the neighborhood that is not already landmarked into landmarks. And actually that will actually help preserve, much of what's there and do it in a way that is, makes, a lot of these buildings eligible for grant money. So, with New York City landmarks, we know how restrictive it can be. And we often say that it's beautiful to be in a historic district, but it's almost better to purchase outside of a historic district just because it's so difficult and expensive to maintain those outside facades in the way that the Landmark Commission will approve it. However, at the state level, it doesn't work that way. It actually, they're just kind of encouraging and making available grant money that wouldn't otherwise be available.
Got it.
So, that's one of the more interesting aspects of the neighborhood. But right now, the other 2 districts out there, you've got the Sugar Hill Historic District, which we've talked about in other episodes, which is really from 145th to 155th. There are some that will also include, going a few blocks further north into that, vicinity and into that historic district. It's not actually technically part of the historic district, but I think a lot of people count it, especially given some of, the history of buildings such as, 555 Edgecombe or Triple Nickel, where, so many, famous people have lived, including many, many different jazz legends. And I think we talked about in past episodes about Marjorie Elliott's, free jazz Sunday afternoon, events in our home, no less. So pretty cool. But yeah, that's, often considered part of the Sugar Hill Historic District.
A lot of flavor in that neighborhood.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, then you have the Hamilton Grange Historic District, and that is more in the, vicinity of where Alexander Hamilton's home would have been. You're talking more about like Convent Avenue. You're talking those blocks between Convent and Amsterdam, absolutely stunningly beautiful. And of course, Hamilton Terrace, which for our listeners that are not familiar with Hamilton Terrace, it's sort of not exactly on the traditional grid of Manhattan. It's more of almost like an L-shaped private street. So it's like anybody could go through it, but it's not on the regular grid, and it's just purely residential. It's only a few blocks long, and it's just one of those hidden gems.
I'm reminded, I believe it's a Kool Moe Dee song where he mentions he's from 139th and Convent, or is that Big Daddy Kane? Do you know? I
don't know, but that's interesting. That we might bring that up in another episode. But yeah, there's so much history, and of course, at the end of Hamilton Terrace, you join up with Convent Avenue, and at that point over there, that house on that corner, that was the house that was used in the Royal Tenenbaums.
Wow.
So cool little side fact of pop culture and whatnot. When they decided to start making the movie for the Royal Tenenbaums, they didn't actually have a script yet around it. And what they did is they decided we need to find the house first, and they wrote the whole script around the house. So that in many ways in that movie, the house is a central character to the movie. Huh. So if you haven't seen it, great. Lots of stars in that. Gene Hackman.
Remind everybody the intersection there.
It's 144th and Convent is where the address is, but it's also because of the way that winds up turning around, that winds up being that L-shaped private street of Hamilton Terrace.
Cool.
So it's 144th Convent and technically Hamilton Terrace. So, these are like the two different core, historic districts that currently exist. For the one that is proposed on the governor's desk over there, it incorporates most of the neighborhood. I think they've excluded buildings that were from like the early 70s on forward, which quite honestly, that is just a fraction of the neighborhood. So any areas that weren't covered by the Sugar Hill or Hamilton Grange historic districts, are almost entirely encompassed into that new historic district that they're talking about.
Got it.
So in terms of, higher education, and, that's something that we'll talk about quite a bit, especially because, we've talked about Morningside Heights and, how many higher educational, institutions there are, within that neighborhood. I think it's a total of 8, if I remember correctly, the most famous being, of course, Columbia University. But, kind of in a neighborhood, certain neighborhood aspects. Now, Columbia and City College are kind of like, head to head. And it goes back to, almost as a reminder of the prime days of City College, where, kids would get their entry level from, schools like Harvard, and they wouldn't want to accept. They'd want to wait and find out to see, did I get into City College? And, I know we mentioned in past episodes, how about, City College would be, I think they called it, the Harvard on the Hudson. So, ultimately it attracted more people that have ultimately won Nobel Prizes than any other school.
Wow.
So, that's a certainly big part of it. The City College campus is partially split between Hamilton Heights, and a little bit also goes into Manhattanville, with the main academic buildings, or at least the original campus, being in Hamilton Heights. Some of the newer buildings, and this is one of the things that have really kind of changed, or had been changing the composition of these neighborhoods, has been, Columbia was investing somewhere between $6 to $7 billion in Manhattanville. City College also invested another $600 million in two new science center buildings, and those are just south of the Hamilton Heights border. So, that's the reason why I'm mentioning it, is just because both of these campuses are expanding. They're nearby, and obviously in the case of City College is also inclusive in the neighborhood. So, these are big investments into the neighborhood, and it's not like, if you're looking at from a residential real estate standpoint, such as Mark and I, as agents, there's really not a whole lot of private purchase opportunities in Manhattanville. And then if you go south into Morningside, prices certainly start going up. So right now, Hamilton Heights is well connected with transportation. Having a total of 5 different subway lines within the neighborhood. So I think it really provides that combination of being affordable right now, primed for prices to go up in the long run, and certainly it's got the infrastructure for it, with the proximity of these major educational institutions. It's also worth mentioning, though, that, and again, just on the outskirts, and in fact, just even a half a block away at 155th Street, you also have Berequa College, half block north at 155th Street. And I think we mentioned that in the Audubon District Historic District conversations about that facility. Finally, in terms of higher education, and I don't know if this necessarily goes into higher education, more like high school, but specialized high school, which New York City does well. Contained within the campus of City College, you have a STEM high school program, and it just got ranked number 1 in the city, and I think top 5 in the state.
Wow.
So this is really, another major, plus for the neighborhood. In fact, I even have a client that specifically sold their home in Park Slope and bought in Harlem, not too far from Hamilton Heights, because their child was going to be going to the STEM program.
Wow, that's really a boon to the neighborhood. And if you look at the grid, there are plenty of subways up there. It's a pretty quick shot to Midtown, so it's got a lot going for it.
Yeah, and in terms of a lot going for it too, is one thing that many neighborhoods in Manhattan don't have easy access to. I think everyone is always thinking of in terms of parks, is Central Park or Riverside Park, but these are some of the larger parks in the city. However, in Hamilton Heights, you have many different parks in the area. We've mentioned earlier in this episode St. Nicholas Park, where Alexander Hamilton's house has been moved. It's on the edge of the neighborhood, and that's kind of what divides Central Harlem from Hamilton Heights, and obviously the Heights aspect is a big differentiating aspect between those two neighborhoods, and it's a natural border. So that Manhattan schist, and the drop down, that really makes an easy defining border for these neighborhoods. So that's the first park, is St. Nicholas. You have Jackie Robinson Park, again, and it follows that same kind of east-west dividing line as you go north and south over here. But this is the northernmost portion, that is contained within Central Harlem. And it goes from 145th Street up to 155th Street. And it's the dividing line between Hamilton Heights and Central Harlem. And again, there's a big, giant elevation difference between that. And you still have the natural schist outcroppings as a result of the Ice Age period. And it just kind of moved all those rocks over. So it makes for a great dividing line. We still have Riverside Park, which actually goes up through and ends in the very southern portion of Washington Heights, but we still have access to Riverside Park, throughout Hamilton Heights.
That's where you get to Fort Tryon, Riverside Park hits Fort Tryon Park, or is it a little before that?
Fort Tryon Park is actually much further north. So Riverside Park ends at the Riverside Oval at 157th. Fort Tryon is roughly around, I want to say, 40, 50 blocks north of that.
Got it.
But there are a lot of parks, going into Washington Heights and Inwood as well. So, considering the ratio over here, and I'm not even done with the parks yet. We still have Riverbank State Park, which is one of the rare state parks in Manhattan. I believe there's only one or maybe two other state parks in Manhattan. I know one is on the Lower East Side, and this is like the most trafficked one. It's actually right off the highway, but you can access it as a pedestrian. There's pedestrian overpasses over the highway, and actually, the park is actually on the riverbank itself, which is why it's called Riverbank on the Hudson, and it's absolutely huge. And it's the only building of its type in the Western Hemisphere. The only other building of a similar nature is found in Japan. So what they did is they took a water treatment plant, unfortunately sewage. But what they did is they put in all these filters, and then they built above the park, and they built above the plant, and they built this wonderful park. In fact, I know that there's a whole full-size track and field. They just redid that, and the football and
I believe
soccer.
Tennis as well, right?
Yeah, they've got like everything there. So yeah, they've got tennis, they got handball, they've got basketball, baseball fields. This is all built upon that structure. So it's absolutely beautiful. You're on the waterfront. You're overlooking the GW Bridge. You can see all the way down to, Jersey City. It's absolutely spectacular. And in fact, when Macy's does their July 4th fireworks on the Hudson rather than on the East River, it's a great spot for viewing the fireworks without needing to deal with, going all the way downtown in order to view it.
Right.
So it's kind of like it's extended actually into the river. So, you're at a spot that makes for absolutely great fireworks viewing. In terms of smaller locations as well, there's a few other smaller parks that exist. One of the ones, I'm not going to point all those out because there's a bunch of them. But one that I specifically want to mention is the Carmansville Playground. Not a large park, but it's notable in many different ways because anybody that knows basketball or NBA has probably heard of the battlegrounds. And, and if you're not a basketball player, a fan or you're a player, I'm not a sports guy, but even still, I've heard of the battlegrounds, and not even being a sports guy. And actually, this is where Kareem Abdul-Jabbar learned how to play.
Wow.
This was his home court. He lived in the neighborhood, and, basically, if you go to the battlegrounds, you're expected to play and play hard. It doesn't matter whether you're a professional or whether you're an amateur. Either way, the expectation is that you're giving it your 100%. So the Carmenville Playground is quite notable for that. We'll talk a little bit more about Carmenville and that in another episode. It's kind of like the lost neighborhood, but the Polo Grounds were just a few blocks away, and that was like the original home for the New York Yankees, and I think it was the New York Giants back in the day as well. But since that was only a few blocks away, you had people that had, that just loved sports, that were professionals, that just went to the Carmenville Battleground playground to play basketball. And that included, somebody like Willie Mays, for example.
Wow.
So he'd go and play stickball or basketball with the kids after practice sometimes. So
that's so cool.
Yeah. So, you get some really cool stories over there. And even though it's a very small playground style park.
So where were the Polo Grounds exactly?
So the Polo Grounds, and we'll actually have a whole episode on the Polo Grounds, but that was just north of 155th Street. So previously we talked about the Morris Jumel Mansion. Well, the Polo Grounds were actually, when you're looking at the current museum and the grounds over there at 160th Street, you would look down on the, much like you would with Hamilton Heights versus Central Harlem, you'd look down to the east, where the ground is just so much lower. And the Polo Grounds were in that like 155th to like 160 something, the low 160s area. So, obviously that's been wiped out. But if you walk over there, I can tell you there is an awesome staircase that gives you some of the reminders of where the Polo Grounds originally were.
Oh, I think I've actually walked up that staircase.
Yeah, it's kind of in poor condition these days, and I'm hoping the city will put a little bit of money into that. But
sort of sits under a bridge or beside a bridge that takes you to the Bronx.
Yeah, it's near there. It's a little north of that bridge.
Got it.
So that gives you a sense. So on to the next topic of Hamilton Heights, housing, condos, co-ops, townhouses. So, what's notable about the, housing opportunities in the neighborhood is that while there's some larger buildings in the area, much of the neighborhood is characterized by low and mid-rise buildings. So it's pretty typical to see most of the buildings be 8 stories or less. If you're walking along Broadway, though, it's more common to see like 12-story buildings. But, in comparison to what you hear, for those that might be listening outside of the city, everyone is accustomed to thinking of Manhattan as, all these major high-rise buildings and skyscrapers. Not the case in Hamilton Heights. So, it's a pretty low-lying neighborhood. Basically, in 2012, there was a rezoning in the neighborhood intended to keep the neighborhood low-lying. There's been a recent rental building that actually just started opening in the last month or two. And that actually was able to get around the zoning regulations because of the nature of its lot. It was formerly being used as a Verizon parking lot for their trucks. It got within the parameters of the zoning, they were able to build a 30-something story building, and literally it's a rental building that just opened up. So, but it's not characteristic of the vast majority of the buildings in the neighborhood. Just giving you a sense, in terms of co-ops, most of the buildings tend to be HDFCs. just the nature of what had happened to the breakdown and composition of the neighborhood, back in the day, and 50s, 60s, 70s as the neighborhood started degrading, and obviously now we're back in the upswing. Things are really improving significantly, but as a result of so much that had degraded, a lot of the buildings wound up defaulting. The owners basically said, we don't want it. The property taxes, the water and sewer bills, they're worth more than I can get in rent. So they gave it up. The city wound up becoming owners, and the city wound up selling it back to the tenants themselves. And that is what makes up an HDFC. So, for the most part, that is, the composition of, the co-ops in the neighborhood. Condos, on the other hand, they're mostly either like a townhouse conversion, which there's not a lot of them, but there's more than you'd probably expect to see for a neighborhood this size. But majority of the condos in the neighborhood, they were rental to condo conversions, largely from one particular developer, or as we call them, sponsors, Pinnacle. And, Pinnacle is, like, most people know them from what's known as the Riverside Drive condominiums. And they're from Riverside Drive from 143rd to roughly around 160th Street on Riverside. So if you're going in that stretch over there and you see a condo, I think all but two were at some point a Pinnacle condo conversion building. So there's 710 Riverside, which was one of those rare buildings that wasn't. And then there was 779 Riverside that also wasn't one of the Pinnacle. But all the other condo conversions and that whole stretch from 143 to around 160th Street on Riverside, they're all part of the Pinnacle condo conversions. Pinnacle also had a few other buildings, such as 441 Convent, and then two up on Bennett Avenue, much further north. But that represents a large portion of the condo inventory in the neighborhood is these condo conversion buildings.
Kind of in contrast to what I think most people, when they think of a Manhattan condo, kind of have an image of the Midtown condo with the glass windows and the whole thing. This is more of a classic-looking architecture. Yeah, exactly. And, this is a much more classic-looking architecture. These are mostly pre-war conversions. There's a few buildings that are like 1950s, but, these are much, much older buildings. So, yeah, you're absolutely correct. This is very much in contrast to that look. So, since you mentioned more of that modern, kind of look, we don't really have those glass buildings in Hamilton Heights. But what we do have is a total of, and this all depends on how you define that eastern border, as many as 8 ground-up newer construction condos, and I'm defining that as post-2000. So there's only a total of 8, and that's assuming that those two on buildings on Edgecombe, that you're counting that in the neighborhood borders. So it could be as low as 6, depending on how you view that eastern border. And I think for a lot of first-time buyers, there's tax abatements on a lot of those buildings. The developers are taking advantage of that. So, contrary to new development, again, further downtown, you're likely to have a little more flexibility up there.
Yeah, and in terms of those tax abatements, I'm glad you mentioned it. Now, I personally purchased in one of those 8 new construction condos. I did get a 25-year tax abatement. And believe it or not, and this is so shocking to like anybody I talk to, my property taxes for that first 20 years of that tax abatement, and I kid you not, but a cup of Starbucks costs more than my monthly taxes. So I'm literally, and I'm not even exaggerating, I might be off by a penny, as much as a penny, but my property taxes are $3.50 a month.
Wow.
It might be $3.51. I'm not sure on the rounding aspect, but yeah, literally a cup of Starbucks costs more than my property taxes for the first 20 years.
You could just sit down in a taxi, you've already paid more money.
Yeah, exactly. And that's just at the moment you sit down.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, that was one of the things that did attract me to the neighborhood, and I bought, from the developer brand new. So I've been maxing out that opportunity because, where else are you going to get $3.50 a month property taxes? Right. So, in terms of townhouses, there's Hamilton Heights is a townhouse-rich neighborhood, and brownstones. There have been a lot that over the years wound up getting cut up and became SROs, and SROs are it stands for single room occupancy. They're kind of also known as like boarding houses, and if you want to use the polite way of describing them, they could be also almost like a bed and breakfast type of setup where you have a bedroom that you're renting out, and bathrooms and kitchens are most likely communal in most SROs. So in that case, they are, if you're looking to buy or sell an SRO, they are very difficult purchases, but at the same time, they are part of the neighborhood. You saw a lot of them on the Upper West Side and in the 80s and prior to that, but, a lot of them have been converted to, 1 to 4 families, in most cases, over the years on the Upper West Side. You're starting to see the same in, Central Harlem and Hamilton Heights where these SROs exist. But, right now it's still a large portion of the inventory. And know that for the most part, the very, very few banks, if any, that will finance an SRO. So mostly these are all cash transactions.
Got it.
So, moving on over here, and in terms, I always like to try and bring back, interesting aspects. And, one of the original early homes of the neighborhood that still exists, and it's got a very interesting story to it, is the James Bailey Mansion. And everyone is wondering, who the heck is James Bailey? And, I say odds are if you grew up in this country, and you're probably over the age of 30, odds are you probably know who, James Bailey is, just don't realize it. But if you know the Barnum and Bailey Circus, well, sure. That is, that the Bailey portion of it, that is James Bailey.
I always think, whenever I hear that name, I think of the elephant. Whenever I hear that name, I think of the elephant standing on the drum with his paws up for some reason.
Yeah, I think that was like their logo. Either that or it was the animal crackers. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah.
That might have been a hit.
I'm mixing them up.
So, yeah, this was an absolutely spectacular mansion. And I know we're starting to run long on this episode, so, but this is like such a cool aspect that I want to discuss. It's one of the rare single-family unattached mansions that remain in all of Manhattan. These things are rare. There's only a handful of single-family unattached mansions. It's over 8,000 square feet, if I remember correctly. And the glass windows in there, they're stained glass, but that's not what makes it so fascinating. The guy that designed it, he was a cousin of Louis Comfort Tiffany. Even more exciting is that he designed many of the stained glass windows in the form of circus animals. So, obviously him being a circus guy. So,
how apropos.
Yeah. So, I mean, that is so awesome. And those stained glass windows still remain to this day. So, even though the mansion had fallen on hard times, at some point it wound up becoming a funeral home. And then ultimately it became abandoned. I guess the owners of the funeral home had passed, and apparently I had heard stories, and I think we'll elaborate more on this on another episode, and maybe even make its own episode. But there was like a whole pack of wild dogs that were running around the neighborhood and called that the mansion its home. So I heard something about that. So we'll find out more on those details. But I think it was when he built it, he expected that it was going to be the billionaire's row of its day. But, in 2008, it's worth noting that at the beginning of 2008, the house was put on the market. It was in poor shape. It needed millions in restoration, but it's just so unique and inspiring. It's got a turret, those castle-like turret, pointy features on the roof, and that has since been restored by the new owners. But what's most interesting over here is in 2008, they originally listed the mansion for $10 million. And keep in mind that it needed a lot of work. It needed millions in restoration work. Ultimately, they wound up cutting the price, and at the end of the day, this was early 2008 when they first listed it, and the market was eroding until what happened in later 2008 is we had that real estate market crash, and the market crashed in the stock market too. As a result of all that, the house ultimately did sell all cash for $1.4 million.
Ooh,
so that's an 86% price reduction.
That's one heck of a haircut.
Yeah, but I got to say, the new owners have done the house justice. They've restored the turret. They're working on the back, the back deck area, and working to restore everything as it originally was. At least, exterior wise, certainly, to a large degree, interior wise, and the house is actually up for rent on a regular basis, not for residential, but for movie shoots and TV and movie shoots. And actually, I recall seeing it on an episode of Law & Order, a recent episode. It was, I believe, I want to say season 20, where you had Sean Wallace, or Wallace Shawn, I'm not quite sure his name, and Judd Hirsch featured in it. And Judd Hirsch is almost like going back home, because Judd Hirsch is among the famous graduates of City College. And being that this is at 150th and City College is at 140th, it was almost like he was, filming back at his college days. So, pretty cool. I know we're running a little on the long side, so I want to kind of move through, our last points that we want to discuss on the neighborhood culture. There is, Harlem School of the Arts and the Dance Theater of Harlem are both located in the neighborhood. I know the Dance Theater of Harlem went viral, unfortunately, during a viral period of COVID when we had all the lockdowns. The Dance Theater of Harlem created an outdoor video on the campus of City College, and doing what they do, dancing, and that video went viral, and people all across the world were viewing that during the lockdown. So kind of a cool thing to note. Other things that are worth noting over here, and I had already mentioned Alexander Hamilton. This was land owned by him, and his estate still remains in the neighborhood. There's some new buildings coming to the residential side soon, likely rentals. Subway access. There's the A, C, B, and D. The A and the D are express down to Columbus Circle. There's always lots and lots of filming going on in the neighborhood, and we'll routinely see, a lot of the recording, like Blue Bloods and Law and Order SVU, and there's a lot of cool stuff that I've seen over the years, the filming. In fact, Steven Spielberg, I saw him right before I was moving in, and it was supposed to be Brownstone, Brooklyn, the ending of Munich, and they were filming it, and that was actually right before I closed my home. So that was kind of cool. There's future subway and Metro North access that's been proposed. I doubt it'll happen, but you never know. An extension of that 2nd Avenue line proposal that could go up as far north as 137th Street in Hamilton Heights. There's also possible, and this has been floated by the MTA, it's reliant on them getting everything with those connections down to a combination of Grand Central and Port Authority, and getting everything connected there. At that point, once they've achieved all this, which we're getting pretty close now, then there's the possibility of them adding a train station stop, along the Hudson River at around 135th Street. There was originally a train station stop there, so potentially they could wind up adding it back there. When the Harlem Piers Park opened up, it possibly gives us commuter ferry service at around 135th Street as well. So most of few last points before we wrap up on this episode. Most of the biggest names in jazz have lived or visited in the neighborhood, and Convent Avenue in the 140s has been named one of the most beautiful blocks in the entire city by at least a couple of different publications.
Yeah, the architecture up there, and as well, as we've discussed, there's some hills up there, makes it a bit of a different landscape. Really lovely.
Yeah, absolutely beautiful. Although hiking some of those hills is not always fun, but
especially in this humidity, boy, I tell you.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess the final 2 points I want to bring up is the Audubon mural project, Trinity Cemetery, where John James Audubon is interred. It impacts some of the aspect, and there was an art studio that sponsored building creating all these murals on the side of buildings. Various birds. So, that was one aspect. And finally, and I just kind of mentioned this to some degree, there's Trinity Cemetery. We've talked about it in a couple of different episodes. It's located in Hamilton Heights, right on that border over there. And, you have numerous early American figures interred here. You've got Eliza Jamel, who we've talked about in an entire episode. John James Audubon, former Mayor Ed Koch. How am I doing? He was famous for knowing that. John Jacob Astor, he died on the Titanic. And we've also done an episode on the Astor family, in the past, and connecting the dots there. Alfred Tennyson Dickens, son of Charles Dickens, and godson of Alfred Lloyd Tennyson. And we've also talked about Clement Clark Moore, and we'll talk more about him in a Christmas episode coming up as well. More recently, you've also had former Law and Order star, the original Law and Order, Lenny Briscoe, or his real name was Jerry Orbach. So, he was interred there too. And, also scenes from the Royal Tenenbaums were shot in the cemetery as well. So first you had the house at 144th and Convent, and you also had scenes from the cemetery roughly around 10 blocks further north.
Good.
So that gives you a nice overview of the neighborhood, and we'll talk more about Hamilton Heights in various episodes. But we wanted to give you a nice, solid overview of the neighborhood, and hopefully you found this interesting, and gets you up and visiting the neighborhoods. But I want to thank you again for joining us in another episode of Harlem Stories.
A lot of great facts there. Thanks, Adam.
Thank you.